Hey everyone, and welcome to Grade 2 of the Carrot Poker School. If you've come here from Grade 1, you're going to find the complexity beginning to ramp up a bit at this point, and if you've chosen to start here, then I hope that you find this the right difficulty level for you. Our first class today is on polarizing and condensing. These are two of the most fundamental ways in which ranges can filter: aggressive actions, causing polarizing effects in theory, and more passive actions such as calling or checking, leading to condensing effects. In today's class, we're going to really unpack what each of these concepts mean and understand how to apply them to hand reading, to range construction, and to our holistic poker framework. Let's get started. We'll begin with an exercise on checking behind on the flop. Button starts in this spot, single raise pot with 57% range equity, so clearly a favourite. Then, big blind checks the flop procedurally, checking all of their range over to the button. The button player then checks behind. Which of the following terms do you think best describes what happens to button's range when he checks back here? Pause the video, think about each of these 6 terms, and simply assign a label of true or false insofar as they describe the effect of this check on the button player's range. Okay, I'll assume that you've done that, and you've unpaused the video. Well, firstly, weakens. Does this check weaken button's range? I understand there's a little bit of semantic difficulty with some of these words, especially if English isn't your first language. Some poker players use these words strangely. Even if English is their first language, they will use a word that doesn't quite mean what it would mean in the dictionary. And I think with weakens, we should be talking about overall equity. We shouldn't just be talking about one part of the range. I don't think it's correct to say that a range weakens if it's just the top part that has become less abundant. What button's check will do is certainly make combos of ace-king, 10x, quads, full houses less abundant, but it will not weaken the overall equity that much. Because the button player in theory is supposed to be protecting this checking range and not actually moving towards bad hands, in some sense button will be moving away from bad hands when they check this flop because a lot of the air combos are going to be betting. Betting ranges are the typically most polarized thing, and checking ranges are less polarized. So weakens isn't really going to nail this. It's going to miss the mark somewhat because the overall equity barely changes. I like to get out of the habit of only focusing on the top of ranges when someone checks back and get into the habit of understanding the overall equity advantage should be maintained through this flop check. This is, however, a condensing action. Condensing actions move a player's range towards the middle. They somewhat squash that range. Whereas a range starts off being wide and sprawling, covering many different combos at different frequencies, post-condensing, a range is going to be more focused around medium strength hands. In this case, it's going to mean that the button player has a higher frequency compared to the rest of his or her range than before with respect to hands such as jacks, queens, kings, and ace-x. Bad ace-x, I should add. Some other hands that are fairly mediocre here could be things like king-queen, pocket 5s, pocket 7s, and these hands too will increase somewhat in frequency after the flop check. These concepts are not absolute. We're not saying that a range only contains these hands now, or contains all of the combos of these hands. We're merely saying that it shifts towards a higher concentration of the aforementioned combos. So condensing, the opposite of polarizing, is what happens when a more passive action than what could have been selected is selected on a given node, such as this flop check, where button would easily have been crafting a betting range. Is capped? Well, this is again not an absolute notion, and capped is something that can apply to an extent. I think this is certainly true. The button range is going to move somewhat away from trips here. Surprisingly, it is okay in game theory to slow play a hand like trips, much more so than it would be to slow play a hand like a bolt or a set. A set on an unpaired board is typically a much stronger hand than trips, not just in terms of its equity, but also because it's likely to take up less of the board and unblock cards on the board that the opponent can pair and invest money with. Note that when you have a 10 here, the only thing that you actually unblock on the board is an ace, and an ace is not going to be as happy to invest on a board with trips on it as it is on an unpaired flop. So clearly having trips is nowhere near as good as having a set. However, you do still want to bet your trips at a high frequency. It's a strong hand and it's capable of getting multiple streets of value. But for most trips combos, you don't actually have to bet here. Game theory is going to slow play some of these hands. So while we're willing to admit that the button's range is capped through this check back, we don't want to say that he cannot have a 10. We should always be very wary in poker of using extremely strong language such as always, never, and all other absolute terms. While these can be true sometimes, for example on a board of ace 10-3, it would be correct to say that there are 0 combos of pocket 10s in a checking behind range on the flop, but on ace 10-10 we can't say this of trips. Keeps range advantage. While technically the equity does decline ever so slightly, I think it's more than fair to say that the button retains the range advantage here and is still in a fairly favourable world in terms of EV after checking back here. It's not that the button suddenly forfeits all of their advantage in the hand, range versus range. If this was happening, you would have to wonder why they would be building such an unsound and overly capping flop checking strategy. It shouldn't be permissible for the big blind on the next street on the turn probe opportunity, as we're going to see, to just lead randomly and erratically, because big blind should still be suffering from range and positional disadvantages. Button very much maintains the equity advantage here when they check behind, and when we talk about range advantage, we're always talking about equity. Other factors such as position, nut advantage, and other favorability concerns are going to fall under the scope of EV, not equity. Keeps nut advantage, this one is certainly false. While we do still have some 10s and a decent amount of good ace-x in our range when we check back here, we will have shed these hands at a higher frequency than we'll be shedding most other hands. Therefore, it's fair to say that while our range shifts away from the nuts, this is going to grant our opponent a catch-up effect in terms of nut advantage, which wasn't particularly big anyway. Boards on which the button starts with a large nut advantage would be lower ones where overpairs are thriving. When an ace and a 10 are out on the flop like this and there are 2 of one of them, what's going to happen is that the big blind can very easily catch up to button's range and can actually outdraw hands like kings, queens, and jacks in multiple ways. It's very important to note that nut advantage is better for the razor on lower, drier textures, generally speaking. Polarizes, being the opposite of condenses, which is basically the most true term here for all of these adjectives. Polarizes is therefore the most false. It's incredibly inaccurate to say that a check would polarize a range, because a check moves a range slightly away from the extremities, strong and weak hands, towards medium equity hands. The check can contain other hands too, but what it certainly doesn't do is eliminate medium hands more often than it does strong and weak hands. That's what a bet would do. Bets are generally polarizing and checks are going to be condensing. The exception to this is when you're making one of these actions with all of your range. For example, if we just focus briefly on big blind's check here for a second, when big blind checks the flop out of position to the preflop razor, we'd deem that a procedural action that would be happening with all of their range, and therefore the button player is going to be unfazed by this, not drawing any conclusions about the way that big blind's range is contracted, because it has neither polarized nor condensed. So when we're interpreting a line, it's important to put this in the right sort of gradable and cautious language. I would like us to think in terms of the following. We can say that X line skews Y range towards Z hand type when X is taken more with Z than with most other hand types. So if we replace X line here with check, Y range with buttons range, and Z hand type with pocket kings, queens, and jacks, we can say that the line check skews the button's range more towards queens, jacks, and kings than it does most other hand types. If this statement is true of a hand type, then we can say that that hand type is middling when the strategy is a passive one that condenses the overall range. If, on the other hand, the line is a more aggressive one, then it would make those mediocre hands less abundant compared to other hand types, and our statement here would become false. It's important to be careful with language from the get-go. Semantics are part of how we learn and discuss the game, and so I much prefer this kind of language than saying something like, we have kings a lot now, we don't have ace king, we don't have 10x. While these things are possibly true to an extent, they are gross exaggerations and definitely distort the way that we think about the game. We're going to be using a lot of gradable language like this, and one of our main lessons today is going to be understanding what terminology to actually use to be healthy as we move through grade 2 and increase the complexity of the material. So the check here skews button's range towards medium equity hands, not just kings, queens, and jacks, but also some lower pocket pairs, though you'll note that the frequency of betting does increase as we move down the way. I've not highlighted 6s, 5s, and 4s with the same cluster of hands as I have 9s, 8s, and 7s, and the reason for that is that they are less frequent checks. The reason that they check less frequently is that they benefit a bit more from denying equity to the opponent based on the fact that the fold equity they obtain by betting is a bit more useful. You can also see examples of ace deuce through ace 4 here, which look like quite good hands, but when you think about the investment ceiling for such mediocre top pair, it should become apparent quite quickly that these are not hands that are interested in building a gigantic pot, and therefore we really don't have to bet them right away. Sometimes people object and say, but what about the draws? There are flush draws and straight draws in villain's range. There are many reasons why this is not a complete or good thought process, nor a sufficient reason or even close to one for betting a hand like ace 4, but we'll come to this imminently. To summarize for now though, the reason you don't want to get obsessed with the draws in your opponent's range is that when it's a flush draw or combo draw, your value bet is incredibly thin anyway, it's barely even a value bet, and of course you never cause that hand to fold unless you're playing against a rank amateur. Secondly, when those hands do continue, they often have much higher EV than their equity because they're implied odds hands. They can raise, they can bluff later. You don't always win the pot from them even when they miss. Thirdly, there are just so many other parts of villain's range that are relevant here, and fourthly, if villain has a weaker draw like a gut shot, you're value betting against that hand. That's not supposed to fold either, especially not to a 1/3 bet on the flop. In case it's not obvious by now, the color coding we're going to use here when we use a Pio screenshot like this comes from Pio Solver True. The orange is going to be a bet, and as that shade gets darker and closer to red and then purple, the bet size will increase. Orange is the smallest bet as the lightest shade there, and green is of course check or call. You will see blue in some of these and pink, and these are fold and raise respectively. So it's only mildly so that button skews towards medium equity hands. Button still has some combos like these. Not all of the Jack 10 at the very top of the range or close to the top of the range are eliminated, and not all of the Jack 8 are either. We just see in GTO a shift towards the middle. That's the key point. If this bet was bigger, which I wouldn't recommend, you'll see that in grade 1 where we talk about range and nut advantage in lecture 5. But if this bet was bigger, we would not see any combos at all of hands like 8s, 9s, Jacks, Queens, ace 4, ace 5, these would basically all be gone and the range would become much more polarized. It's not really a good idea, however, to play a bigger c-bet on a board like this because of the inherently polarizing effect that a texture like this has on the big blind's range. As we know from grade 1, and as you will probably know already if you've started at grade 2, betting big into polarized ranges doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Mild condensing now. Let's call buttons check on the flop a mild condensing action. Mild condensing actions remove less middling hands than they do good and bad hands, thus pushing the equity distribution a bit towards the middle. They don't do this in a particularly strong way, and they need not necessarily eliminate good and bad hands from the range entirely. After a mildly condensing action, an in-position range will have similar equity to what it had before it checked, but that will change again on the next node when the out-of-position player either bets or checks the turn. The reason that the equity roughly stays the same is that if you have good hands, middling hands, and bad hands, and you move towards the middling hands, you haven't actually affected the overall strength of the range. If you shifted towards the top, your range would get stronger. If you shifted towards bad hands, your range would get weaker. But when you move towards the middle, it's just the top of your range that suffers. But because you're eliminating bad hands at the same rate, you're actually just maintaining a similar equity to what your range held previously. So Button's range now has less combos like these. Queen 10, obviously going to be a frequent bet, although because it's trips and not a set, it can slow play more than most other hands that look this good on the flop in position. Out of position is another story, and of course we can slow play a lot more there when our opponent still has a chance to bet. We'll see this in lecture 5. There'll be also less hands like Queen 7. These are bad hands. They're meant to bluff more than the global bet frequency for range. Whenever I say global frequency in this course and in other grades of the school, you will know that I mean the overall and average betting frequency for your range, not talking about any one combo when I say that term. So hands like Queen 7 won't be betting all the time, but they'll be betting more than the global frequency for a range, and Queen 10 will be the same thing. These are both hands that constitute the polarized regions of our range, and therefore they become less abundant when we take a mildly condensing action like check. And we'll also have more hands like ace 4. Ace 4 is a hand that's good enough to value bet. It's an optional value bet, more on optional value bets later, but it's certainly not a hand that has to value bet, and if we were to increase the sizing, this hand would just become a pure check. Now we come to one of the most important metaphors that I introduced in the school. Sometimes I like to think metaphorically in poker because poker can be such a dense game that actually Illustrating things through real life concepts can cause some learning neural networks in the brain that wouldn't really develop otherwise, and can actually make the poker thought process more natural and more automatic. If you'll entertain this weapons metaphor for a second, we're going to say that button lands on the flop with 3 rough categories of hand on a texture like this, and on any texture, but especially this texture. Power 1 hands are not very good weapons. Wooden spoons would not be very effective in a fight, so you wouldn't want a bag of weapons to be full up with wooden spoons. To make this metaphor a bit more analogous to poker, I don't want you to imagine that you're wielding 6 wooden spoons here simultaneously, but maybe that you just have a bag of weapons into which you're going to dip your hand and pick out one at random. You're not allowed to feel for what the weapon looks like or feels like, how hard it is, what it's made of, nothing like that. You're just going to take one out at random. So if you have a lot of wooden spoons in the bag of weapons, the chances are that you're going to bring out a fairly weak weapon most of the time. Power 2 weapons, we're going to refer to these as knives. They're much stronger, much more effective, and we would much rather pull a knife out of the bag in a dangerous situation for us than a spoon. And a power 3 hand is analogous to a gun. It's the strongest weapon of the 3. These categories are obviously batches. They're going to be knives that are better than others, spoons that are worse than others, and some guns will be the immortal nuts while others will just be very strong. But we're going to think of anything that's 10x or better here as a gun, anything that's around ace-x or under pair or really good king high as a knife, and something sub good king high as a spoon. Unless it's a draw, in which case it will be a knife or gun. Big blind will land on the flop with a slightly different concentration of these things. Big blind will actually have a higher concentration of wooden spoons in their range than the button player will. The reason for this is not actually that the big blind has loads of unique bad low hands that the button doesn't have. It's more that these are a bigger proportion of the overall range, because big blind would have 3-bet many of the bigger cards and bigger pairs, thus concentrating the range more around low to medium cards than the button opener's range would be. When we think of a combo such as 5-4 of hearts here, which is about as bad as you can get on ace 10-10 with no hearts, you can imagine that that is the epitome of a wooden spoon. It's actually the weakest of wooden spoons, and while both players have 4 combinations of 5-4 of hearts, those 4 combinations are a much bigger part of the big blind's range, which has less combos in it, than they are of the button's range, which has more combos in it. Again, the reason the button player has more combos overall than the big blind is that they haven't got rid of any hands by 3-betting. They've just opened a flat 40 to 45% on the button, whereas the big blind is going to be folding or 3-betting enough hands to have way less than 40% of total hands after they call, be closer to 25 or 30%. There are less power 2 hands in the big blind range. This is kind of a bad thing, given that the spoons are so abundant. You would rather have more knives to bring the relative hand strength up a bit from power 1 towards power 2. There aren't that many knives here because the big blind player doesn't have any combos of hands like kings, queens, jacks, or even nines here, and is going to struggle as well to have king, queen, king, jack, and will also be 3-betting a lot of the suited and offsuit aces pre-flop as bluffs or value bets. There are just way less ace-x and pair combos and king-high combos in the big blind range than there is in the button range. When it comes to guns, there won't be as massive a difference here, but there is going to be slightly less 10x concentration in the big blind range. This is because the 10, being a Broadway, being a relatively high card that can combine to formulate a Broadway combo with other cards, is going to be 3-bet at a relatively high frequency compared to some other cards. This is going to lead to a slight deficit in power 3, but nothing major. So we can say that the overall range advantage here lies with the in-position player because they have less wooden spoons, bringing down the effectiveness of the arsenal. More knives, which is a good thing when your opponent has a lot of wooden spoons, because a knife is plenty good enough to beat a spoon, and then slightly more guns. But the main power advantage here just lies in this knife to spoon comparison here. The guns are fairly close. Not all flops are like that, of course. Some flops are going to lead to a big gun advantage, power 3 advantage, just not this one with the 10 being quite abundant in both ranges. One fundamental truth that you may remember from grade 1, or you may just have come across on your own studies, is that range advantage is the factor, that means equity, range versus range, is the main factor that governs the global betting frequency of a range. Nut advantage, meanwhile, governs the bet sizing. So out of position here has far more bad hands than in position. This is actually the biggest factor that contributes towards the big blind having a large range disadvantage in this spot. The wooden spoon, or power 1 disadvantage, actually comes not from having too few combos, but by having too many hands that fit this category of bad to awful hand. When we think about the big blind's range just containing 7-6 as a bigger percentage of their range, or Queen 4 or something that they would rarely 3-bet as a bigger percentage of their range than that sort of combo would be of the button's range, we can understand how the big blind out of position range starts to drown in very weak combos, and that will bring down the overall equity of that range. Secondly, the knife disadvantage is going to come from not having enough knives here relative to the in-position player. This is because knives are both abundant and decent hands. If you imagine that poker is a sort of game, which is, where stronger hands are harder to come by than weaker hands, that's kind of how the whole hand hierarchy works and why it functions. If you imagine poker as that sort of game, then you can understand why guns are rare and why knives can have a bigger impact. As there are more spoons and knives compared with guns, meaning more weak hands and medium hands compared with good hands, you're actually going to really prioritize having more knives than spoons, because these two classes make up a lot of your range. So this might seem like just having a lot of average hands, but a lot of knives are actually good because guns are just really hard to come by anyway. Just flopping trips is difficult naturally in virtue of the fact that there are 2 10s here that you have to hit, and you only have 2 left in the deck. Therefore, with the ace, there's still 3 aces remaining in the deck. So actually having less decent hands, less knives, less power 2 hands than your opponent is kind of bad, because what it means is that you're likely to be skewed towards the power 1 hands, the spoon hands, instead, because guns are hard to come by for anybody. So this is actually a bad thing. The out of position player here would much rather have more knives than spoons and not the other way around. I think it's fair to say that the button is just mostly knife heavy, whereas the big blind is mostly spoon heavy, and this is the single biggest thing that causes the range advantage, that 57-58% equity swing in favor of the button here. The gun advantage is only going to be very slight for in position big blinds. Disadvantage therefore is only going to be very small across power 3, meaning that the nut advantage is probably closer to neutral than it is to being favourable for either player. We noted in grade 1 that nut advantage is not a race. It's not who pips the other person at the post, who gets past the finish line first. Rather, it's about, does one player have a much bigger advantage with respect to nutted hands than the other? And this isn't really the case here, because the 10x is just so spread between both ranges. So only a small nut advantage here for the in-position player, and this is indeed not where the majority of the range advantage resides. However, if you ask a beginner to intermediate poker player, why does button have a range advantage here, they'll very often just start listing 10x combos that the button is opening. This is actually a small part of the puzzle, because so many of these are shared among both players. Okay, let's talk a bit about delayed c-bet opportunities then. So after the flop goes check check, the in-position player lands on the turn with the opportunity to bet. This is what happens on the flop. We see that the in-position player is doing very well at the bottom of ranges. This is an equity distribution graph, and what this basically means is that along the x-axis here, we have the concentration of each player's range, the percentiles of each player's range, from the strongest percentile down to the weakest percentile. Each dot on this grid basically explains that that is one combo. As the dots are closer together and start to actually look like a line, that's just lots and lots of combos all densely packed close to one another. Whereas when you have a line with no dots, you're basically saying that there are no hands in the range that have that much equity. On the y-axis here, we have the equity of each hand plotted on the graph as a dot along that x-axis of overall range concentration. So when we look at the far left here, we're looking at the lower percentiles of each player's range, and we can see that the in-position player is going to just have higher equity hands more often. Their dots are just going to be doing better than the out-of-position hands are. The out-of-position hands are just going to be weaker on average than in-position, so we can say that in-position has a large advantage at the bottom of ranges. When we move to the middle of ranges, we can see that there is a fairly noticeable but not as stark a difference here between the average medium hand of the button and the average medium strength hand of out of position. There are less of these dots though in the out of position range, and one of the main reasons for that is that the out of position player, the big blind, just doesn't have as many combos of overpairs, reasonable top pair, and good king high. They're just 3-betting a lot of those sorts of cards pre, because they're just typically big cards. So the knife advantage here in terms of equity is not so big. And then the gun advantage, you can see at the very top that both players just seem to have a very similar amount of really good hands at the top here. So what we're effectively seeing is that the bad hands here that are in the button range are not as bad as the bad hands in the big blind range on average. The knives are a bit better and a bit more abundant in the button range. They have more hands like ace queen, ace jack compared with ace four, ace deuce. And then at the top, it's basically neutralized. There is not a nut advantage here really, but there is a big range advantage. After the flop goes check, check, the spoon advantage is still left intact. The big blind player, unfortunately for them, actually just has to continue checking here with all of their total junk combos. We'll get to this later, but the idea is that you just can't go bluffing out of position with absolutely tiny equity in a spot where your range is suffering. You actually need your range to be doing quite well in order to bet those kinds of hands. This explains why button can bet these hands on the flop, but big blind can't probe the turn with them. Thus, a lot of these really bad hands get left in the big blind range, and the spoon advantage is still going to be very much in position's favor because in position just has less horrible hands. There is again a small knife advantage. It's a similar picture than before, although as you can see now, the in position player is actually moving even more towards mediocre hands here. They have a bit more of a stark jump here in terms of equity on the turn, and that's because on a brick turn, mediocre hands have actually got better, so they're now higher equity than they were on the flop by virtue of the turn not being some flush or straight completing card that would negate the strength of like queens or something like that. And then at the top, the gun advantage is still pretty tiny. Now what we see is that neither player really has these hands very frequently now, but still you could just basically simplify to saying that the nut advantage is not really in anyone's favor on these nodes. When button gets a chance to delayed c-bet here, what's going to happen is that big blind is going to have less of these hands because they've checked the turn again, and button has less of them by checking the flop. If we looked at this slightly earlier and we looked at it just after the flop check check but before the turn check from big blind, what we would see is that the nut advantage was a bit more in big blind's favor at that juncture, but when big blind checks the turn again, they're going to remove a lot of those really good 10x hands plus from their range. Not all of them though. The out of position player is allowed to slow play some hands like that. So as we see here, the flop status quo is very much preserved by in positions mildly condensing flop check. That check does not decimate the range advantage. It does cost a little bit of nut advantage, but by the time that you've got a delayed c-bet opportunity and you've been checked to a second time, you're going to actually reclaim a bit of that nut advantage back again, as we see here from the graph. But note that this is not a node for in position. The situation will change when out of position either checks or bets the turn. So facing a turn check and the flop having just gone check check are two different nodes. When we're the in position player, we never have a decision to make after the flop goes check check, so we're always going to look at the node where we've been checked to again on the turn. That's our delayed c-bet opportunity. Fold equity and world favorability now. World favorability, as introduced in grade 1, is a concept that's all about EV. It's not just about equity. So when we talk about range advantage, we're discussing the equity of one range against another. But when we talk about world favorability, we're also adding to that equity versus equity picture some other factors such as position, implied odds / nut advantage, realizability of equity, and even in the real world, things like skill edge come into it, but of course these things don't matter in the objective realm, where a solver is playing against a solver. So what we see depicted by this graph is that we have world favorability, meaning how high EV a spot on the game tree is for your range compared to your opponent's range on the x-axis. We have the amount of fold equity. This isn't just based on people playing badly or being scared nits. This is theoretical fold equity. This is how often a solver would be folding, how often GTO recommends folding. So it's based on objective factors like EV and hand strength, range strength, stuff like this. And what we see is that in a neutral world, you will have fold equity that is around what we call the pot odds norm. The pot odds norm is the mathematically expected level of fold equity that a certain bet size would yield if there were no complicating factors and range inequalities. However, poker is a game that's full of range inequality. Very rarely will you have two ranges that are exactly symmetrical and identical. You'll always have one range that's more polarized, less condensed than the other one. You'll always have a range that's stronger than the other one because you just have unequal starting ranges. You don't have people playing the same range pre-flop, so why would you expect those ranges to be identical on the flop. When you hear people talk about the concept MDF, meaning minimum defense frequency, this is really just the inverse of pot odds norm. Expressed as a decimal, it's just 1 minus the pot odds norm would be the minimum defense frequency. These things are calculated completely mathematically and do not account for favorability of world. What we're doing with this figure is illustrating that in more favorable worlds, you will have fold equity that's actually greater than the mathematically expected amount that's derived from the pot odds, and in worlds that are less favorable, you're going to have less fold equity, sometimes especially when your opponent's in position to you, than the fold equity suggested by the pot odds. In neutral worlds, you will see that there's a round pot odds norm fold equity. A lot of spots are neutral worlds, but it's really important to learn which ones are favorable and which ones are unfavorable, so that you can understand when it's okay to just bluff anything that you want and when you have to add equity to your bluffs and be more selective. One of the biggest mistakes humans make is actually thinking that they always need equity to bluff, they always need some form of bailout in the form of a draw. This isn't always the case if the world is favorable. So effectively, in favorable worlds, we're going to have a higher bet frequency, we're going to be obtaining more fold equity when we bet, and in less favorable worlds, we're going to have less fold equity and want to be more selective about what we bet and our global bet frequency. We find the mathematically expected fold equity, known as the pot odds norm, by dividing the bet that we're facing into the total pot after we put that bet in there. Basically, bet divided by bet plus eventual pot, or bet plus pot is the metric we want to use there. The area under this graph is basically showing the number of hands in our range that we can bet. As the world gets more and more favorable and fold equity goes up, our range becomes stronger and more full of value bets, and the trade-off we get when betting for denial, basically making our opponent fold live hands that are worse than ours and risking extra against better hands in the process, is more in our favour when our range is much stronger than that of our opponent. It's a dreadful blunder to bluff with a very low EV bluff, a very low EV hand, or hand with bad equity, in the left-hand worlds. The reason for this is that you actually need to have something else going on in order to make up for that deficit in fold equity that you're suffering due to the world being unfavourable. I will say, however, that if you look at a solver, you will very often see pot odds norm fold equity in unfavourable worlds. But the reason for this is that the world is only unfavourable up until you bet. If you bet, the world ceases to become unfavourable because it's never correct to continue inflating the pot while continuing to leave the world unfavourable for yourself. So what we'll see happen in theory is that when someone has a bet opportunity in a world that's unfavourable for their range, they'll actually dump most of the very bad hands into their checking range, planning to fold to a bet and leave their betting range a bit stronger. This neutralizes the world and gets rid of this deficit of fold equity. We do not see solvers underfold due to somebody betting when the world started out unfavourable, because it's no longer unfavourable for the better after they bet. If you have the choice between betting and check folding, and you have far too many combos of air, you'll put most of those combos of air into your check fold range. Building an unbalanced and weak betting range in a spot that's bad for you is a blunder, it's a procedural error, and it's something that you definitely want to avoid. Just because the world is unfavourable doesn't guarantee that the fold equity is less than the pot odds norm after we bet if we've built the right betting range. However, if we just bet randomly and erratically in a world that's unfavourable for us, then the fold equity theoretically becomes tiny because our opponent can see our strategy and they do that. Of course, in the real world, our opponents can't see exactly what we're doing, but I'm just showing you what happens in game theory. I'm showing you what happens if you knowingly play a strategy against an opponent who knows your strategy. It's not good. Your fold equity plummets if you bet too much of your range in a world where you have too many bad hands. It's a dreadful blunder, similarly, to check air on the river in the right-hand world. So when the world is great for your range, what happens is that fold equity is at a premium, it's through the roof. This is a factor that does remain the case after betting, because someone who's facing a bet only has one way to shed the really bad hands from their range and avoid making too many investments. They can't check anymore, so that has to come from folding. So what you will see happen in GTO is that when someone has a big range advantage and then they bet, their opponent will then be folding more than the break-even point for the better. This forces you to bluff in worlds that are good for your range and bad for your hand. Never check down a terrible hand in a really good world for your range to the river. We'll see this later. Probing the turn now. This is the node that occurs in the game tree when the flop goes check check and the out of position player has the chance to bet. As I said before, orange bets are small, 33% pot, red bets are bigger, 75% pot, and these purple bets that you see on screen here are actually over bets for B150. That's right, the strategy that the solver is recommending for the out of position player here is a very big bet at a very low frequency. Most of this range is checking because the world is unfavourable for the out of position player. However, based on the fact that out of position is mainly interested in crafting a betting range around ace jack plus here for value and then bluffs, the biggest sizing makes the most sense. As we saw in grade 1, it's your value combos that truly drive the sizing that your range wants to pick. So when simplifying to one bet size, as is usually what we're going to be doing before river, we want to pick the size that makes the most sense for our value hands, our bluffs accommodating said sizing. But back to favourability and fold equity for a second, we can see that it would be a blunder to bet the Jack-6 of hearts in this very bad realm for our range. Fold equity here is actually less than the pot odds norm. If we go crazy, it's even worse, but even if we build a sensible strategy, fold equity is still worse than the pot odds norm. That's to say, even if we contain ourselves to only bluffing with hands like flush draws and gut shots and things of this nature, we're still going to be getting less fold equity than that break-even point for total air that we'd need if we had nothing. And that's because in position as position, you always want to defend a little bit more than that pot odds norm when you're in position if there is action still to come. The reason for this is that the next street will always be more favourable for you and less favourable for your opponent than it would if the positions were reversed or neutral. Neutral is impossible, but just as a thought experiment. What we see here then is that betting with Jack-6 of clubs, hearts or diamonds is an absolute no-go for the out of position player. When you're running a fold equity deficit and you're in a disadvantageous world like this one, you need to have some kind of standard about what you're betting. However, if the shoe is on the other foot here and you check to the button player will be able to bet any Jack-6 combo until their heart is content. The reason for this is, of course, that button is in a favourable world, not an unfavourable one, based on the fact that they have position and a range advantage. So favourability has a lot to do with everything, and one of the most important concepts that relates to favourability is how strict you need to be with your bluff selection. Let's look at equities and EVs by node now. What we typically see here is that when the flop comes down, the in-position player has a lot of EV. You'll note that this EV is actually more than the equity. So in-position EV is 63% on this flop of ace-10-10, and in-position equity is 57%. The reason that the EV surpasses the equity is that being in position gives you a boost, but also there are some other things going on there, like having a bit more absolute nut advantage and hands that are entitled to many times the pot and have a lot of implied odds. The out of position player, needless to say, has the opposite EV and equity to what we have and is suffering a lot in many of these spots. When we look at different turn cards here, we can see overall trends that some cards are better for a range than others. I'm going to get you guys to explain this table a bit more in the homework task associated with this lecture, so I'm not going to say too much more on that just now, but feel free to pause the video and have a look over this data just now, and then I'm going to quiz you on it at the end. But what we can see in general, just to wrap up a few points here before we move on, is that EV is much higher than equity for in position. This is based on the positional advantage and the nut advantage. Nut advantage will actually cause a hand to get more EV than their equity will suggest. That's because a hand that's really strong on ace-10-10, such as 10-9, is going to be able to bet the flop, the turn, and the river, and the times it actually gets called, it will win incredibly often. The downside will be very slight, few and far between are the times that we get stacked with trips here, but we do win 3 streets from an ace relatively frequently when our opponent calls down, and so this nut advantage, having hands that can win multiple future bets, not just bets now but later on as well, is going to give your hand more pot share in real life EV than the equity that you actually have. We saw in grade 1 that while it's impossible to have more than 100% equity in the pot, you can have more than 100% EV when you express EV as the chips as a percentage of the current pot. The idea being that you can win way more in the future than what the pot is currently. So nut advantage and positional advantage are very key, and they explain why the in position does even better with EV than they do with equity. On to delayed c-betting, which is a highly favourable situation. This is the solver's raw output when asked to explain how it will play the turn after the flop goes check check here, and then the turn is checked again by the big blind. This is the button's in position betting range. You'll see that hands like aces don't really exist here because they were just bet almost all of the time on the flop. However, surprisingly, we do get to this spot with quite a lot of 10x combos, although we get there with way less than we do a hand like kings, which is a mediocre hand, which we move towards when we condense by checking the flop. So this situation must be highly favourable. If we're able to bet a hand like 8-6 suited at some frequency, and we can see this here by going to our grid and noting that 8-6 suited is an optional bluff. This means that while we are allowed to bluff, we don't have to bluff with this hand. We can note that if this hand is allowed to bet, then we must be in a favourable world. It's kind of like backwards inference, because we know that in unfavourable worlds, we're running at a fold equity deficit, or we're just not able to bluff air hands because they're too bad and aren't getting a bonus of fold equity to make up for how bad they are. So if we're able to bet hands like 8-6, 9-6, Jack-5, etc., we must be in a favourable world. You'll also note here that the solver seems to be fairly torn between a small bet and a big one, but either play would be reasonable for our purposes. You can simplify to either one here. We're going to simplify this to a big bet in position because it's not really necessary to make small bets in position, but we'll talk about that a bit more in lecture 2. We don't have to take this strategy as gospel, guys. We can run subtrees, which is where you just limit the solver's action and get it to resolve the spot from the turn onwards, and they will show no EV loss. They'll basically show that it's okay for us to adapt the strategy and play slightly differently to the solver without losing EV. In favourable spots, it's essential that we bluff quite freely. Definitely betting hands like 8-6 here is something we must do at a reasonable frequency if we're to play a solid strategy and take advantage of how good the scenario is for our range overall. But nevertheless, you will hear people say arguments like these for checking here, and they can seem very persuasive until we see that they're actually flawed. People might say, I have better bluffs. They might say, I don't want to bet 8-6 suited because I have better bluffs. I could have a gut shot, or I could have a spade blocker or a flush draw, and I'd rather bet those hands. Issue with this is that it has nothing to do with whether this hand is a bet or not. What really matters for the EV of betting a hand like 7-5 suited or 8-6 suited is how good it is to bet that hand compared to how good it is to check that hand. Not how good it is to have that hand compared to a hand you don't have. That doesn't really matter. I would rather have a gut shot. That's about your preferences. That's about your emotions. It's not really about an EV assessment of whether it's better to bet or check with a hand like Jack-5. It should be equally as good. But the only reason it's okay to wait is that you can bluff the river. You actually have to bluff these favourable worlds at some point in hand. And finally, this is a common one. I would rather have a spade, or I would rather have 2 spades. Again, this is about preference. It's a visual thing. It's very striking to feel happy when you have 2 spades here because there's a very strong visual impression of that. But don't let feeling happy about your hand, don't let your brain interpret that as being the same feeling as wanting to bet. Wanting to bet is not the same feeling as having higher EV, because you should be betting polarized, especially in spots that are really good for your range. You should be betting low EV bluffs as well as high EV ones. So actually, when you have a hand like 9-6 of clubs here, you should feel lousy about having a terrible hand that has a very small entitlement to the pot, but you should still feel that betting is the same EV as checking, because in theory it is. In fact, against most humans, I would go as far to say that betting 9-6 of clubs here is better than checking, because most humans at the stakes that you guys will, by and large, be playing are not going to protect their out of position checking range sufficiently, and aren't going to have enough check raises in there to punish you. So actually 9-6 may well become more of a bet than a check when you think about that, and you also think about the fact that humans tend to bluff the river quite often in nodes where it goes check, 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 check all the way to the river. Again, this comes from mass data, this comes from stuff I've built when I was running my exploitative course, and it's a bit out with the scope of today's topic, but I thought I'd mention it. I think it's a particularly bad leak to have these thoughts when you're against a human with an even weaker range as the out of position player than what GTO would have here. So far, we've talked extensively about the condensing effects of checking. We've seen that checking moves your range towards the middle, and it will, to some extent, eliminate strong hands and weak hands from your range, but by no means eradicate these entirely. When it comes to calling bets, however, we can refer to this as a heavily condensing action. So when big blind calls the flop, the action is a much more strongly condensing one because we're eliminating folds and raises at a much higher frequency, bad hands and good hands, that's to say, at a much higher frequency than we would be if we just checked in a spot where we could have bet. So when we have a look at the big blind's GTO response, remember that fold is blue here, green is call, and pink is raise. This is the flop response. We can see that the sort of range that we'd arrive on a turn card with here is the green hands, and these are going to be mostly mediocre hands. We don't have as many combos here of even stuff like gut shots as we did before because we raise these at a higher frequency than globally. The average raise frequency here for our range is only about 11 to 15%, something like that. And we can see here that we're raising Queen 10 25% of the time, for example, and Queen Jack as well, so both a good hand and a bad hand there, raising more often than the average raise frequency for our range. When we look at hands that never raise, we see mediocre things like 8s, 7s, King Queen, stuff like this. When we look at the hands that fold, naturally, these are going to be the very worst hands in the big blind's range. And that's what's going to move this range very strongly away from the top and the bottom, especially the bottom. When you fold the flop here, you're actually folding at a much higher frequency than the pot odds norm fold equity would be in a neutral world. And the reason you're doing that is obviously that the button has a big range advantage, but when you do that, you're skewing your range massively away from terrible hands. Terrible hands are the one thing that you cannot continue in any way, shape, or form to even a small c-bet on this flop. So when you land on this 3 of hearts turn, you just don't have any of this trash anymore. Your equity has gone way up by condensing heavily by calling a flop c-bet. So it's exclusively the worst hands which are folded to our bet. We don't mix up our strategy by sometimes folding a pair of aces. I'll just fold a pair of aces this time to mix things up and keep my opponent guessing. That would be ludicrous. We just fold from the bottom up. Contrast this to the light condensing effect of a check, where some very bad hands were actually checked at a very reasonable frequency. So while the in-position player did move away from the bottom of his range a bit by betting flop, that player still had air that was waiting to bluff later on, remembering that air does have to bluff at some point when you have a range advantage that you maintain by checking flop and then checking turn. We see here that with the heavily condensing call, there just aren't any of these air combos left in the big blind's range, and that's going to cause a big spike in equity. So turn barrels are fairly favourable spots. When you've c-bet the flop on a good board for your range, you are formally in a very favourable spot, but when your opponent calls, they actually become an equity favourite. It's kind of weird, right? Because the EV here for in position on this turn barrel opportunity, having c-bet flop for button here, is only 52.6%. That's 6 or 7% less than button's EV was on the flop. And the reason for this decrease in favourability, an increase in favorability for the big blind, is that big blind has just shed all of the worst combos, all of the wooden spoons, whereas button has still kept many spoons in their range. So as this spot is quite close to neutral, I think 52.6 is better to think about this as neutral than it is as favorable, even though it is technically slightly favorable. We expect villain to fold around the pot odds norm percentage of the time. So when we bet 75% pot and we need 42% fold equity to break even when we've picked that sizing, we'd expect villain to fold somewhere around there, possibly slightly more. This can be noise. There can be quite a bit of fluctuation in these fold equities within like 1 or 2%, and it's probably not worth worrying about that. The main point is that we're not getting massively more fold equity than the pot odds norm like we would have been on the flop. Since there is no abundance of fold equity in this spot, we're not getting way more than we need to break even. There will be some very bad hands that have very poor blockers, which now qualify as mandatory give-ups. In other words, they're not even eligible for bluffing. There aren't as many of these hands as you would think, and certainly on the flop there were basically none of these hands. We could bet whatever we wanted, being in a highly favourable landscape for a range. But this heavily condensing call that the big blind player has now made has pushed our range equity down. We're now a dog in terms of equity, only a slight favourite in terms of EV because of the redeeming qualities of being in position and having a nut advantage, but it's not enough to allow us to bluff the very worst hands in our range. So when we have negative removal here and actually block villain's backdoor flush draws, which are now folding, villain would have things like Queen 9 or Jack 9 of diamonds on this node, but wouldn't really dream of having Jack 9 of clubs or Queen 9 of hearts here. And for this reason, if you are going to bet with a hand like Jack 5 on this node, it's not actually going to be the Jack 5 of diamonds that you're allowed to do it with. So certain hands are total give-ups here, but hands that don't have these negative blockers, like 9-6, which is just a fairly lousy draw to second/third pair, whatever way you want to look at it, this hand can still bet, and the idea is that this hand is not actually that. It's a bad hand, just as Jack 5 is, but it doesn't skew villain's range as much towards calling the turn bet, blocker-wise, as Jack 5 or Queen 4 of diamonds do. The main reason for this is that when you have a card like the 9 of hearts or 6 of hearts, you've actually already folded out the stuff that those hands would block, so you're not blocking the folding range as hard anymore as when you're blocking a backdoor flush draw that actually had a reason to hang around on the flop and call your flop c-bet. Have a think about the word hairy as an adjective. This is going to be all about why polar is a gradable adjective. I want you to think about hairy, and I'll talk about what it means to say that a word is a gradable adjective. Well, if something is hairy, like this dog, it's not just either hairy or not. It's not like there's a switch that gets flicked and you just go from being bald to being hairy instantly. There are dogs that have more hair than others, same with people, and there are many words in the English language like hairy that cause extents of things to be true and not just a black and white yes or no, true or false. It can be true to a small extent or a large extent. I could say of one dog, that one's a bit hairy, but this one is very hairy, without sounding ridiculous. That's how you know an adjective is gradable. When you can specify some modifiers like this, we'll call them extent modifiers without sounding silly. So hairy is gradable. Polar is like hairy. It's almost always true to some extent or another, and that extent can very well vary. When we talk about a range being highly polarized, we might be referring to somebody who just overbet the turn and then jammed the river for 3x pot. However, when we talk about a range being a little bit polarized, we could just be talking about someone c-betting 33% of the pot on the flop, with maybe 70% of their range. While that action is barely filtering at all, it does filter in a slightly polar direction, and it's fair to say that since we can describe both very polarizing things and slightly polarizing things with the word polar, that polar has to be taken with a pinch of salt in the same way that hairy does. It's only true to some extent, not fully, and rarely is it not true at all. Almost all creatures have some amount of hair, almost all betting ranges have some amount of polarization, apart from range bets, but those are another story. Consider the word boiling now. When water is boiling, is it fair to speak about this in the same way? Can you say, that's a little bit boiling? Can you say, that water's quite boiling, but I'd like it to be more boiling before I put the pasta in? When you have a recipe, it says bring to the boil, make the water boiling. It doesn't say boil this to this extent or have quite boiling water. Boiling is either true or false. There are many other words like this, such as illegal or whatever, where it just swings. Like there's a black and white, there's a law, and what you do is either against the law or isn't. Yes, there's some grey areas, but that's more to do with interpretation than actual semantic meaning. What I'm trying to say here is that very few poker terms are like boiling. Generally, all poker terms and adjectives that are about ranges, capped, uncapped, weak, strong, wide, tight, polar, dipolar, linear, merge, they're all true to some extent. Very rarely are they just all fully true or fully false. So polar is not like boiling, but many people take it to be because they ask questions like, is his range polarized here? That's an incredibly misleading question because the answer is usually yes to some extent, but not as much as certain other ranges or other actions would indicate. Now we come to Clark's theorem, which is the only thing in the Carrot Poker School in 30 lectures that I've named after myself. I'm a fairly modest guy, and so I don't want to name everything after myself, but I thought, maybe my dad would like it if I named one thing after the family name. Totally didn't do it for selfish reasons, So the more polarized villain's range is, compared to yours, so assessing relative polarization here, the smaller your bet sizing should be, and the less often you should raise. This final part about raising is actually just the very same thing as the part about bet sizing, because when you choose to bet smaller rather than bet bigger, what you're doing is having a less polarized strategy, usually. And when your opponent is more polar than you want to choose to bet smaller rather than bigger. When you're more polarized than your opponent, the opposite is true, but consider facing a bet now. It's almost like you have two bet sizes, call and raise. So just as you choose a smaller bet over a bigger bet, when your opponent's range is quite polarized compared to your own, you would choose a call over a raise more frequently, or at least you'd be more likely to with more combos when your opponent's range is more polar than yours. And what matters here is not just who has the slightly more polarized range, but what we're really asking is one range much more polarized than the other? For example, on a monotone flop, I don't really want to bet big, not because Villain's range is way more polar than mine, but because mine isn't way more polar than his. However, when I'm on a blank turn and I've just bet the flop, I'm going to be very happy to overbet usually, as long as it's not a sort of monotone or paired texture, because I'm going to have a big polarization advantage. That's to say, I'm going to have a much more polarized range than my opponent. We can then extend this and state the inverse, that when you're more condensed than your opponent, or when your opponent's range is more condensed than yours, the larger your bet sizing should be, and the more often you should raise. Again, the last 2 points are really the same thing. Making a large bet instead of a small one is like choosing to raise instead of choosing to call. Our raise, after all, is nothing more than a call plus another bet. Clark's theorem is really useful because it always holds you accountable to pick the right sizing, know when you need to raise and when you shouldn't be doing much raising, and assess relative polarization. Assessing relative polarization might be a skill that sounds a bit daunting to develop at first, but once you get used to it, it's actually very easy. In essence, ranges that have aggressed a lot have generally polarized a lot, and ranges that have called instead of raised or checked instead of bet have done the opposite. They've condensed. For the final part of today's lecture, I'd like to show you a bunch of different textures and talk about how relative polarization is changing on each and what that does to strategic considerations. The first one I want to think about is 5-4-3-6. These are all taken in a double barrel node, so the button player has the chance to bet again on the turn. This range looks very weird, right? You have a small bet or you have a check, no big bets. This is because the polarization advantage is tiny. The hands that the button player had the monopoly on, which would have been things like aces, kings, queens, jacks, have been totally negated by this turn card and didn't even want to bet the flop in the first place. So there isn't really any kind of nut advantage here for the in-position player. Ranges are very equalized at the top, and in fact, the 7x concentration is probably going to be much greater in the big blind's range than it will be in the button's range. This doesn't mean the button can't bet at all, it just means that picking a smaller size when you choose to reopen the action here is correct instead of a bigger one, a la Clark's theorem. Another thing that we can note here is just how weird and unusual this landing range is for getting to the turn. Ignore the green and orange shades for a moment and just look at the overall distribution of which hands we show up with at all. In other words, which hands aren't grayed out. We don't even bet the flop with many of our big cards or big pairs here, so we actually arrive here with a range that looks more like a calling range pre-flop than a raising range, but this is based on the flop texture actually being really, really good for our opponent and very bad for us as the in-position player. You can see that this range is polarized to an extent, but it's not completely polarized. Again, polar is a gradable adjective. We can note this by observing how 9s, 8s, hands like this that are semi-thin value bets are still able to bet. Clearly it's not an incredibly polarized range, but there is also going to be a middle part of it that does want to check. When we have a hand like King 5, for example, we just have too mediocre a hand to want to bet, and we're going to be checking all the time. I would describe this strategy as semi-polarized. I describe it as a small bet strategy because of the lack of nut advantage that we have in this spot and the extent to which Clark's theorem really forces us to use a smaller bet instead of a bigger one because of the fact that our range doesn't hold much polarization relative to the opponent's range. Basically, Villain's range is going to also contain some pretty good and pretty bad hands here, just like ours is, and neither player is going to really have more nutted hands or less medium strength hands than the other here. So small bets are going to be the way to go. The paired board, not as bad for your nut advantage as the spot we just looked at. This is a spot where at least your overpairs are still kind of holding their own. Yes, it's not great that the turn was a 9. We would have much rather, when holding queens or kings or aces, had a turn come that was a deuce. Such a turn would actually have allowed us to consider overbetting. This color here is a B75, this sort of red shade, it's the medium bet size. And the reason we pick a medium bet size here is that our nut advantage is moderately okay, but nothing special. It's much more than it was on that low 4 straight board where it had been completely neutralized. But on this 9 turn card, what's going to happen is that the 9x combos, which aren't hugely abundant, but they are still a significant part of the big blind range, are going to become more common. And as a result, we're going to want to bet a bit less often and not go for an overbet when we do bet. The idea with overbetting this street would be that if we did it, we would force our opponent's range a little bit too heavily towards 9x. Certainly wouldn't be true to say that he's only calling with a 9. Again, beware this sort of absolute and stark language and vocabulary that you hear from poker players from time to time. It's very misleading and dangerous for your game. But you could certainly state that villain would move uncomfortably close to having 2 9x heavier range for your bet to be very high EV. Therefore, what you really want to be doing is picking a sizing that your value range still is comfortable value betting, and your value range here isn't really going to be a 9 that frequently. It's going to be a lot of combos of top pair and over pairs as well, as we can see here. And the only real sizing that hands like this want to bet is a smaller one than pot. Of course, we could go for an even smaller bet still here, but that's a little bit too far in the opposite direction. Clark's theorem here still says that because you have a lot of combos like queens, kings, aces, ace-jack, king-jack more often than your opponent does, and because your opponent's 9x is not a huge part of their range, that you're still going to have some degree of nut advantage here, and you can still bet big, you just can't bet giant. So that's what happens on a paired turn. For your notes, a flush turn is very similar to this. A flush turn and a paired turn tend to reduce the polarization gap within the two ranges by a similar margin, and therefore on a flush turn it's also going to be really common that you see big bets but not over bets. The small bet that we saw in the previous slide is actually a very rare guest in position turn strategy, and it's more likely that when nut advantage has been neutralized and when Clark's theorem says bet smaller, it's not actually telling you to bet tiny, but just not to overbet. The brick turn is the classic example of where overbetting is correct. Remember, the purple color is the biggest option here in terms of bet sizing and denotes a 150% pot size bet in this situation. The reason that the 6 is so good to bet big on according to Clark's theorem is the idea that your range is now vastly more polarized than that of your opponent. Upon betting the flop, it's fair to say you didn't polarize your range much because you would be betting pretty much everything, if not absolutely everything, on king, queen, deuce. But your opponent actually depolarized, he condensed by calling the flop. So the reason that your range is way more polar than your opponent's here isn't that you've polarized it massively already, it's that your opponent has gone in the other direction and taken a heavily condensing action. When your opponent condenses heavily and has the sort of pre-flop range, it just didn't really manage to hit any nutted combos on this flop anyway, and those that it did hit, like deuces, would have raised the previous street. You can go ahead and increase your sizing. The idea is that you will just have way more value hands that are absolutely crushing in terms of equity. Hands like top pair, two pair, etc. here can have easily 85-90% equity, possibly more, although that's a bit trickier on a turn like a spade that creates a flush draw. If this had been the 6 of hearts, you would see even higher equity values for the top of your range. And so the way we capitalize on this is that we want to increase the pot towards a higher investment ceiling by the time all is said and done. And so we've got a bit more pot building to do in the here and now in order to achieve that goal. So we're going to see many hands here like pocket aces actually prefer an overbet and stay in equilibrium. In theory, that there's an EV loss, in fact, from betting smaller. But when we actually think about how condensed our opponent's range is and think about the theorem we've just learned, that should make perfect sense. If you don't have overbets in your game yet and they're not really a facet of your play, that's okay as long as you're comfortable overbetting the river instead. If you're missing both turn and river overbets though, you're very likely to be losing EV, especially because a lot of populations don't raise the turn or river enough against smaller bets on textures like this. Let's talk a little bit about bluffing and value betting and just remind ourselves of a concept we touched on in grade 1, but with a little bit more of a jargony definition now when it comes to bluffing and value betting, can, can't, and should. There are elements of bluffing present when heroes bet would fold out a significant amount of hands that have a great deal of equity against heroes' hand. So what we're saying here is that bluffing is all about folding out high equity hands. If all of your fold equity comes from hands that you're just crushing or beating heavily anyway, you can't really think of that as bluffing. So a bet will not even qualify as a bluff type of bet if there aren't elements of bluffing present. And elements of bluffing means that a lot of your fold equity does come from hands that have a lot of equity against you, possibly even hands that are crushing you or beating you. Hero can't bluff if there are not elements of bluffing present. So if you're in a situation where your fold equity doesn't come from hands that have very much equity at all, then you're not even considering bluffing. This is a can't bluff spot. For example, when you have pocket nines on a turn of king, queen, 5-4, although there is fold equity present, you can actually say that there are elements of bluffing present because the fold equity comes from hands you're just crushing anyway. Villain doesn't really fold a queen or a king to a b75 on this turn. Sure, if you overbet, you might actually start to add some elements of bluffing, but more on that later. It's going to be a very expensive and not worthwhile proposition for 2 nines, which can do quite well by checking. You can bluff if there are elements of bluffing present, and the EV of check is not likely to be higher than that of betting. So another problem with the nines is that even if you bet so big that you introduce elements of bluffing, it's not worth it because checking was just a lot better. So an example of this could just be a showdown valueless gutter, a gutter that can show down for much of the pot if it doesn't get there, and you're betting it on the turn just because villain is folding a lot of hands that are beating that hand and doing well against it, like ace high or a pair. Thirdly, hero should bluff, meaning has to bluff, when there are elements of bluffing present and the EV of bet is likely to be higher than the EV of check. Where does this happen? It happens mostly in favourable situations, which occur when your range is stronger than your opponent's and you have a hand that doesn't show down for very much of the pot at all. We'll talk about this next time when we introduce the famous river blunder theorem. On the river, with air for example, where we've called a flop bet and turn has gone check check and the board has run out uneventfully, we'll typically have a range advantage there and we will need to bluff the few air combos we get to that spot with, remembering that when we condense heavily by calling a flop c-bet, we just don't have a lot of air in our range anymore. When it comes to value betting, we can apply a similar methodology in terms of understanding when value bets are mandatory, optional, or even prohibited. There are elements of value present. A definition for actually considering a value bet in the first place is when hero's hand would have a decent amount of equity versus villain's range after the bet gets called. So if you think that when you get called your equity is terrible, you can say that there are no elements of value present and that sadly you just can't value bet that hand. For example, with king high on the flop, it would be very weird to call your hand a value bet because although you can maybe get called by a few worse hands, your equity is going to be severely as an underdog upon getting called, and therefore it's much more likely that if that king high hand is a bet on the flop, it's more as a bluff than it is as a value bet, and you shouldn't really refer to it as a value betting candidate hand. You can value bet if there are elements of value present, again meaning you've got reasonable equity when called, and the EV of check is not likely to be higher than that of betting. If the hand is too mediocre, you might be doing alright when called, but it's just not worth it to bet because check is good, and in position checking has the lovely bonus of not reopening the action, and it therefore allows you to realise all of your equity for at least one street. So for example, with a good top pair on the flop, this would be an optional value bet spot. Because there are certainly elements of value present, you have a hand that's going to be in reasonable shape when called, pretty good shape in fact if you're not betting gigantically, and it's not clear that the EV of check would be better than the EV of betting, because for now you can at least start value betting. With a hand like one pair, it may be the case that you have to slow down later, but there's nothing wrong with making a bet now and slowing down at a future juncture in the hand. And finally, you should value bet when there are elements of value present and the EV of bet is likely to be higher than the EV of check. This only really occurs in position, or possibly on the river out of position with certain blockers, like unblocking a calling range heavily, but usually it occurs in position where it's more urgent to do your pot building sooner, because if you check, you're kind of going to the next street. Unless, of course, you're facing a bet, in which case it's actually a bit more urgent to raise out of position. But generally the only must-value bet spots occur with the very top of your range, in position, facing a check, or out of position, facing a bet. For the most part, hands that are merely quite good, or even very good but not nutted, are very often just optional value bets that you can delay until later. When you're on the river, however, there'll be way more hands in your strategy that are just mandatory to value bet, because this is the last chance for them to build the pot, especially if you're in position and don't have the option of check raising. Now we come to our first homework task for grade 2. With all homework tasks in the Carrot Poker School, I highly recommend that you just give them a try on your own first, so you can feel a bit more involved and proactive. It really does help assimilating the material. What we're going to do here is compare the EVs and the equities in the delayed CBET node to those in the double barrel node. The first third of this table shows you what happens when the flop comes down. The next 3 lines are delayed CBET opportunities, so flop goes check check and in position has the chance to bet across a few different turn cards. And then the bottom third of this table is about a double barrel opportunity after an in position B33 on the flop and an out of position call. What I'd like you to try to do is think about the differences in EVs and equities, the differences across different turn cards, and thirdly, the differences across different nodes. What are the main distinctions between the delayed CBET opportunity and the double barrel opportunity, and why are the EVs and equities different in each? I'd like you to pause the video now, jot down some ideas on each of these 3 things, across these 3 streets, across different turn cards, and basically formulate some thoughts. It's really helpful to write prose when you're thinking about poker and actually jot down words to capture ideas instead of just numbers or diagrams or hand charts. Okay, assuming you've had a bash at that, I'll give you my thoughts now on this exercise. When the flop comes down, the reason that EV is higher than equity is just that position and nut advantage have some say in the matter. These things do affect EV, but they don't affect equity. So while equity can only describe how often the in position range can win the pot, the EV is able to describe positional factors and also how much the in position player can win by value betting later, in other words, implied odds. When we hit the turn in the delayed CBET node, we note that all of the EVs are higher, as are the equities, than in the double barrel node. The very succinct and simple answer for this is that the out of position player has not filtered out their worst hands in a delayed CBET opportunity node because flop has gone check check, but the big blind has done just that in the bottom third of this table because they've called a flop CBET. Remember that when the big blind takes the heavily condensing action of calling the flop CBET, their range equity actually moves up the way because they get rid of their wooden spoons at a much higher frequency than they'd ever get rid of anything else. In fact, they just fold from the bottom up. When considering different turn cards here, it's also clear that the 3 of hearts is going to be the one that's the most bricky, but the king of clubs is the one that increases EV the most. The idea here is that the king is actually going to hit a lot of draws that out of position has, but also ones in position has, while simultaneously missing a lot of the out of position range because king x combos just get folded a lot on the flop. One reason why the equity is so high for in position on the king turn is that many hands like king 5 suited, king 7 suited, king 8 off are c-betting flop in button shoes but folding when the big blind has these hands. So the king turn is incredibly good. It's hitting ace king, pocket kings at the very top, queen jack, but also just hitting a lot of second pair, just improving a load of the air combos of the in position range. And this isn't something that we should forget about. Having a lot of your wooden spoons turned into knives is definitely a really positive thing. The 3 of hearts turn is the one that probably preserves the nut advantage the most purely. This is the turn I'd be overbetting if I were ever overbetting, but the thing is, on a paired flop, if the out of position player is slow playing enough hands, then Clark's theorem would say his range is still too 10x heavy and thus too polarized for us to want to overbet. You can overbet the 3 of hearts turn, I think, against anyone who's failing to protect their calling range on the flop with enough 10x. The 7 of spades turn is generally the lowest equity and lowest EV turn for the in position player on both nodes because this is just a turn that negates the ace x, the pocket kings, pocket queens, which admittedly weren't great, but they're even worse now that the 3rd spade has come a lot of the time, especially when they don't have that card, and ace x 10x has got worse as well. The spade turn is going to help the high density of low absolute hand ranking cards like 6-8, 8-5, 6-5, 6-4, 5-4, all of these hands that actually constitute a higher proportion of the out of position range than they do the in position range. Moving down to the double barrel nodes here, we can see that the pattern roughly holds true across these turn cards. Perhaps the most striking feature now is that the king is now really good in terms of EV for in position, but not as alarmingly good as in terms of equity. What's happening here is that the king turn is just basically increasing the number of king x combos, the number of queen jack, pocket kings, all of these hands, and these were all, apart from queen jack, quite likely to check back on the flop. The final thing I think you should know about this task before moving on to lecture 2 is that the out of position equity on the double barrel node is actually really high. If we look at the 3 of hearts as just a sort of control situation, we can see that the equity for out of position when they've called a flop c-bet is 55%, whereas it's only 38% in the delayed c-bet opportunity for button. This just really shows you that if nothing changes in the run out and you just get a static dry turn, then it's going to be a hugely beneficial effect for your range to have called a flop c-bet. In shedding your wooden spoons and getting rid of your worst hands, your equity dramatically increases, but when we shift over to the EV column, we see that there's not as big an increase there. Again, just to reiterate, because it is important, the difference between EV and equity here for out of position is that equity is just describing how often a hand would win if it went to showdown, whereas EV is describing things like a lack of nut advantage and a lack of position. This is why the EV is so high compared to the equity for in position and vice versa for out of position. These tables show quite a lot of data, and if taken at first glance, it's not particularly useful or applicable, but when you really start to break down ranges and think about combos and actually pair that with action sequences and turn cards, you can see that there are a variety of factors that determine how range advantage and nut advantage are going to behave, who's in a favorable world, who's in an unfavorable world, and in turn, all of these things are going to affect the way we construct our strategies. It's very important to understand why the data in this table is what it is, because only then can you really see that you've assimilated the material of today's lecture. The next lecture will not be quite as dense as this, but we are going to move on to a tricky topic of building a sizing toolkit on every street. So I'll see you for that, and I hope you're enjoying grade 2 so far. Bye for now, guys.